April 7, 1945. Before sunrise, the air over Tokyo is cold and still. A faint coastal wind moves in from the Pacific. On rooftops and observation towers, spotters scan the horizon through binoculars. In underground command rooms, plotting tables glow beneath shaded lamps. Telephone lines hum quietly. The warning comes shortly after dawn. Radar contacts. High altitude. Large formation. It is not unexpected. For months, the great silver shapes of the Boeing B-29 Superfortress have crossed the ocean from the Marianas. Japanese officers have studied their patterns. They know their altitude. They know their speed. And they believe they understand their limitations. The bombers always come alone. But this morning, operators notice something different. Smaller returns. Faster. Lower. Moving ahead of the heavy formation. Within minutes, black specks become visible against the rising sun. Long, narrow wings. Sleek fuselages. The unmistakable silhouette of the North American P-51 Mustang. For the first time, American fighters have escorted bombers all the way to Tokyo. And in that moment, inside command posts across the capital, a quiet realization begins to settle. The distance that once protected Japan has vanished. By late 1944, the strategic balance in the Pacific had shifted decisively. American naval victories at the Philippine Sea in June 1944 had crippled Japanese carrier aviation. Amphibious advances across the Central Pacific had seized the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, placing the Japanese home islands within reach of long-range bombers. From these coral airfields, a new phase of the war began. The weapon at its center was the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. Unlike earlier bombers, the B-29 possessed pressurized crew compartments, advanced fire control systems, and an operational ceiling exceeding 30,000 feet. Most critically, it had the range to strike Japan directly from bases in the Marianas, over 1,500 miles away. On November 24, 1944, the first B-29 raid from the Marianas targeted Tokyo. The results were limited, but the psychological impact was immediate. For the first time since the Doolittle raid in 1942, American aircraft were striking the capital itself, not as a symbolic gesture, but as sustained strategy. Japanese air defense planners had anticipated bombing. They had prepared interceptor units around Tokyo and key industrial zones. Radar installations ringed the coast. Anti-aircraft batteries guarded urban centers. Fighter regiments equipped with aircraft, such as the Nakajima Ki-84 and Mitsubishi A6M0, were positioned to scramble against high-altitude formations. Yet there was one critical assumption embedded in Japanese planning. Distance. The Marianas were far, extremely far. American fighters operating in the Pacific, including the P-38 Lightning and carrier-based F-6F Hellcat, lacked the range to escort bombers to Tokyo and return safely. The vast ocean created a natural defensive buffer. This meant B-29 formations would be unescorted. Japanese commanders believed this limitation provided opportunity. High-altitude interception tactics were refined. Pilots trained for head-on attacks against the bombers' frontal weak points. Night fighter units experimented with radar-assisted interceptions. Even ramming tactics were contemplated as desperation measures. Through the winter of 1944 to 1945, B-29 raids intensified. Initial high-altitude precision bombing proved less effective than anticipated due to jet stream winds over Japan, which scattered bomb loads and complicated bombing accuracy. American planners adapted. In March 1945, General Curtis LeMay shifted tactics dramatically to low-altitude nighttime incendiary raids. The firebombing of Tokyo on March 9 to 10, 1945, devastated vast sections of the city. Tens of thousands were killed in a single night. Industrial districts were incinerated. The scale of destruction marked one of the most devastating conventional bombing raids in history. Yet even then, one element remained unchanged. The bombers still came alone. Japanese interceptors could concentrate entirely on the lumbering superfortresses. Despite heavy losses and fuel shortages, fighter units could attempt attacks without first confronting American escorts. Attrition was severe on both sides, but the equation was predictable. Japanese officers believed they understood the pattern. The B-29 was powerful but vulnerable when isolated. As long as escort fighters could not bridge the distance between American bases and Tokyo, Japan's air defense system retained at least a measure of agency. What Japanese leadership did not yet fully grasp was that American strategy was not static. While B-29s hammered the home islands, another operation was unfolding closer to Japan. An amphibious assault aimed not at symbolic value, but at geography. A small volcanic island, located roughly halfway between the Marianas and Tokyo, had become the next objective. Its name was Iwo Jima, and its capture would quietly erase the final barrier protecting the skies over Tokyo. On February 19, 1945, United States Marines landed on the black volcanic sands of Iwo Jima. The island was small, only 8 square miles, but its location was decisive. Positioned roughly 750 miles south of Tokyo and midway between Japan and the Marianas, it held 2 operational airfields and a third under construction. From these runways, Japanese aircraft had been launching reconnaissance flights against B-29 bases on Saipan and Tinian. Interceptors staged from Iwo Jima could also harass returning bombers. For American planners, the island represented more than a threat. It represented opportunity. If captured, Iwo Jima could serve as an emergency landing site for damaged B-29s. More importantly, it could host long-range fighter aircraft capable of escorting bombers to Japan and back. The battle that followed was among the fiercest in the Pacific War. Approximately 70,000 U.S. Marines and sailors assaulted a garrison of around 21,000 entrenched Japanese defenders commanded by General Tadamaki Kurabayashi. The defenders had constructed an elaborate network of tunnels, bunkers, and artillery positions beneath the island's surface. For 36 days, combat raged across the island's ridges and ravines. Casualties were severe. Nearly 7,000 Americans were killed. Over 19,000 were wounded. Japanese losses were even greater. By March 26, organized resistance had ended. The island was secured. Within days, Seabees and Army engineers began repairing and expanding the airfields. What had been a contested battlefield quickly transformed into a forward air base. Runways were lengthened. Fuel depots were established. Maintenance facilities were constructed. The geographic equation shifted immediately. From Iwo Jima, fighter aircraft could reach Tokyo, approximately 650 miles away, escort B-29 formations, and return without exceeding operational limits. This was not theoretical. It was calculable. The aircraft chosen for this mission was the North American P-51 Mustang, already proven over Europe. The P-51 combined speed, maneuverability, and extraordinary range, particularly when equipped with external drop tanks. Its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine allowed sustained high-altitude performance. In Europe, it had helped dismantle the Luftwaffe by escorting heavy bombers deep into German territory. Now it would be introduced into the Pacific in a new role. The 7th Fighter Command began transferring P-51 units to Iwo Jima in March 1945. Pilots who had trained for long-range missions prepared for flights over open ocean, often lasting 7 to 8 hours. Navigation required precision. Weather over the Pacific could shift rapidly. Fuel margins were calculated carefully. Japanese intelligence observed increased activity on Iwo Jima, but initially underestimated its implications. The island's fall was understood as a setback, but the full operational consequence, that American fighters could now stage from a midpoint base, was not immediately apparent to all levels of command. There were assumptions. Some officers believed American fighters would prioritize defensive patrols over the island. Others assumed that even with Iwo Jima secured, escorting bombers across such distances would strain fuel capacity and limit combat time over target. But the mathematics were unforgiving. The distance that had once insulated Tokyo from fighter escort was no longer an obstacle. On April 7, 1945, P-51 Mustang from Iwo Jima conducted one of their first long-range escort missions to Tokyo, accompanying B-29 formations attacking aircraft factories. Japanese interceptors scrambled as usual. This time, they did not meet unprotected bombers. They met American fighters already waiting at altitude. For Japanese air defense planners, The strategic environment had shifted in a single morning. The skies above the capital were no longer a contest between interceptors and heavy bombers alone. They had become contested airspace in the fullest sense. And that transformation would ripple through tactics, morale, and command decisions in the weeks that followed. The arrival of escort fighters over Tokyo was not simply a matter of geography. It was the product of engineering, logistics, and doctrine converging at precisely the right moment. At the center of that convergence stood the North American P-51 Mustang. Originally designed as a lightweight fighter, the Mustang evolved into one of the most capable long-range aircraft of the war. Its defining advantage was not merely speed or firepower, though it possessed both. It was endurance. With internal fuel and external drop tanks, the P-51 could fly distances previously considered impractical for single-engine fighters. The installation of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, built under license in the United States, gave the aircraft exceptional high-altitude performance, crucial when escorting bombers operating above 25,000 feet. Over Europe, the Mustang had proven decisive. By 1944, it allowed American heavy bombers to penetrate deep into German territory with continuous fighter protection. Attrition rates among bomber crews declined significantly once long-range escort became consistent. The Pacific theater presented different challenges. Vast ocean expanses meant navigation errors could be fatal. Weather systems moved quickly and unpredictably. Fuel planning was unforgiving. A miscalculation by even a few minutes could mean ditching into open water. From Iwo Jima, however, the equation changed. The island's airfield shortened the round-trip distance to Tokyo enough to make sustained escort missions feasible. Drop tanks extended combat range. Once near the Japanese coast, pilots could jettison external tanks, increasing maneuverability for air combat. For Japanese officers accustomed to facing unescorted Boeing B-29 Superfortress formations, this was a fundamental shift. Previously, interceptor tactics focused exclusively on the bombers. Japanese pilots trained to climb rapidly and execute frontal attacks, exploiting the superfortress's limited forward defensive coverage. Others attempted attacks from below, targeting vulnerable fuel systems. Even in the face of heavy defensive fire from remote control gun turrets, there was clarity of purpose: destroy the bombers. Escort fighters introduced complexity. Interceptors now had to contend with agile, high-performance opponents before even reaching the bombers. Climb paths became contested. Formation approaches were disrupted. Japanese pilots could no longer focus solely on heavy aircraft lumbering through the sky. They had to scan for smaller silhouettes, faster, more maneuverable, and often positioned deliberately above the bomber stream. The Mustang's speed advantage compounded the problem. At altitude, it could exceed 430 miles per hour. Its 6.50 caliber machine guns delivered concentrated firepower. In a diving attack, it could accelerate rapidly, choosing when and how to engage. For American planners, the tactical doctrine was clear. Fighters would sweep ahead of bomber formations, engaging interceptors before they could organize coordinated attacks. Others would remain close to the bombers, ready to counter sudden approaches. The concept was not new. It had been refined over Europe, but its application over Tokyo marked the first time Japan's homeland air defenses faced fully integrated long-range escort operations. The psychological dimension was equally significant. Japanese air units had already suffered severe attrition in 1944 during carrier battles and the defense of the Philippines. Fuel shortages limited pilot training hours. Replacement pilots often entered combat with minimal experience. Aircraft production struggled under increasing bombardment. When Mustangs appeared over Tokyo, Japanese pilots encountered not only a new aircraft, but a new tempo. Escorts could pursue retreating interceptors. They could strafe airfields. They could patrol above expected approach routes, disrupting formations before contact with bombers. For the first time, Japanese officers had to consider defending their interceptors as well as their cities. The technological leap of the Mustang thus translated directly into tactical disruption. A defensive system designed around predictable bomber vulnerability now faced layered opposition. Bombers at high altitude, escorts above and around them, and American fighters capable of choosing engagement on their own terms. What had once been a contest of interception became a contest of air superiority. And air superiority, once lost over the home islands, would be extraordinarily difficult to regain. Inside regional air defense headquarters around Tokyo, information moved through layered channels. Radar stations along the coast, visual observers inland, and sector command posts coordinating interceptor squadrons. Before April 1945, these systems operated under consistent expectation. Incoming formations would consist of high-altitude Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers. Interceptors would scramble, climb, and attempt concentrated attacks. Anti-aircraft batteries would supplement the effort. The introduction of escort fighters disrupted the structure at its foundation. Radar operators now track multiple altitude bands. Smaller, faster returns preceded the main bomber stream. Scramble timing became complicated. Interceptor pilots climbing toward expected bomber altitude suddenly found themselves engaged earlier than anticipated. Formation integrity deteriorated under fighter attack before coordinated strikes could be mounted against the bombers. Reports following early escorted missions noted increased difficulty reaching firing positions. Japanese pilots described being engaged immediately upon climb. Some units attempted to avoid escorts by flying lower or approaching from oblique angles, but these adjustments reduced interception effectiveness against the bombers themselves. For command officers, the realization was stark. The defensive buffer provided by distance had evaporated. Tokyo's airspace was no longer contested only at the moment of bomber arrival. It was contested continuously, from the coast inward. Strategic assumptions built over months no longer applied. Angle 4, the B-29 cruise. For American bomber crews, the presence of escorts altered not only tactics but atmosphere. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress was technologically advanced, yet remained vulnerable when isolated. Crews operating from the Marianas had endured long missions, often 10 to 14 hours, with the knowledge that Japanese fighters could concentrate solely on their formation. The sight of escort fighters at altitude changed that perception. Mustangs from Iwo Jima joined bomber streams at prearranged rendezvous points over open ocean. Crews watching through plexiglass blisters saw sleek fighters weaving above and around them. It was a visible layer of protection. Combat reports from April and May 1945 reflected a measurable effect. Interceptor attacks were more fragmented. Coordinated frontal assaults became rarer. Bomber formations experienced fewer sustained engagements per mission compared to earlier months. Losses did not disappear. Anti-aircraft fire remained dangerous. Mechanical failure over long distances still posed grave risk. Yet the presence of escort fighters reduced the sense of isolation that had defined earlier operations. The bomber stream no longer crossed the ocean alone. Angle 5, psychological impact on Tokyo. For Japanese civilians and military personnel alike, the war had gradually drawn closer. Air raid sirens were no longer rare. Incendiary attacks had already demonstrated the vulnerability of wooden urban districts. Yet there had remained a belief, subtle but persistent, that Japanese fighters could at least contest the bombers directly above the capital. When Mustangs appeared over Tokyo, that belief weakened. Witnesses reported seeing dogfights unfold above industrial districts, smaller aircraft diving aggressively, smoke trails spiraling downward. In some cases, escort fighters strafed airfields on their return path, destroying grounded aircraft and infrastructure. The visual symbolism mattered. American fighters were no longer distant threats operating from carriers or remote islands. They were present over the capital itself, maneuvering freely. For Japanese officers, this was more than tactical inconvenience. It signaled erosion of air control over the home islands. The defense perimeter had contracted inward, and now even that inner perimeter was permeable. The skies over Tokyo, once thought buffered by oceanic distance, had become part of a contested battlefield extending thousands of miles. And that battlefield was approaching its decisive phase. April 7, 1945. Shortly after 8 a.m., formations of Boeing B-29 Superfortress approached the Kanto Plain. Their objective, aircraft engine factories and industrial facilities supporting Japan's shrinking air force. The mission was part of a broader campaign to cripple Japan's ability to replace aircraft losses. At altitude, ahead of the bomber stream, flew fighters of the 7 Fighter Command, the long-range North American P-51 Mustang units newly operating from Iwo Jima. The rendezvous had occurred hours earlier over open ocean. Mustangs climbed to meet the bombers at prearranged coordinates, then continued north together toward Honshu. Drop tanks extended range. Fuel calculations were exact. There would be little margin for error. Japanese radar stations detected the incoming force as they had many times before. Interceptor units were scrambled from bases around Tokyo, including fields at Chofu, Naramesu, and other installations guarding the capital region. But this time, as Japanese fighters climbed through layers of cloud and thin spring haze, they encountered resistance earlier than expected. Mustangs positioned above the bomber formation descended into attacking interceptors. Instead of approaching B-29s unchallenged, Japanese pilots found themselves forced into defensive maneuvers. Climb rates were interrupted. Formations fragmented under fighter engagement. Combat unfolded in scattered bursts across the sky. Reports from American pilots described diving attacks on interceptors attempting to line up on the bombers. Some Japanese aircraft attempted head-on approaches against the superfortresses, but were intercepted before closing to effective range. Others broke off entirely, unwilling to press through escort screens. Loss figures from the April missions reflected the shift. While Japanese aircraft were still able to inflict some damage on bombers, the overall interception intensity was reduced compared to earlier unescorted raids. American fighter units reported multiple aerial victories, though exact counts varied in after-action reports, as was common in wartime claims. The effect was cumulative rather than singular. Throughout April 1945, additional escorted missions followed. On April 12th, April 13th, and later in the month, Mustangs again accompanied B-29 formations targeting airfields and industrial plants. Some escort fighters were tasked not only with bomb protection, but with strafing ground targets, destroying parked aircraft and fuel storage areas on return legs to Iwo Jima. 4 Japanese air defense commanders. Each raid reinforced the same conclusion. Interceptors were now fighting 2 battles simultaneously, one against bombers and one against fighters designed specifically to neutralize them. Attrition accelerated. Japan's remaining experienced pilots were limited in number. Fuel shortages restricted training hours. Aircraft production facilities were themselves under attack. Replacement aircraft often lacked performance parity with the Mustang at altitude. Moreover, the presence of escort fighters altered the tempo of engagement. Japanese units could no longer conserve strength for concentrated attacks. They were forced into reactive combat, often at disadvantageous positions and energy states. By late April, the operational pattern had become clear. Escorted bombers would approach. Fighters would engage interceptors before they could coordinate. Airfield would be strafed. Industrial targets would be bombed. Japanese resistance would thin incrementally. For officers monitoring the defense of Tokyo, the realization was not dramatic but gradual, and therefore more unsettling. The capital's airspace had become penetrable not just by bombers, but by fighters capable of seizing local air superiority. The decisive question was no longer whether Japan could intercept bombers effectively. It was whether Japan could contest control of its own skies at all. By late April 1945, the pattern was undeniable. Each escorted raid further strained Japan's already depleted air defenses. The skies above Tokyo and surrounding industrial zones were no longer merely corridors for high-altitude bombers. They had become active combat zones dominated increasingly by American fighters. The North American P-51 Mustang units operating from Iwo Jima began flying not only close escort missions, but aggressive fighter sweeps. These missions sought out Japanese aircraft before bomber formations even reached primary targets. Pilots were authorized to descend and strafe airfields, destroying aircraft on the ground, fuel depots, and maintenance hangars. This marked a shift from reactive defense to proactive suppression. On several missions in April and May 1945, escort fighters attacked airfields in the Kano region, including facilities that had served as key interceptor bases. Runways were cratered. Parked aircraft were set ablaze. Ground crews were forced to disperse equipment under threat of repeated strafing passes. Japanese commanders faced a narrowing set of options: fuel shortages had already limited flight hours. By 1945, aviation gasoline was scarce. Training programs had been shortened dramatically. Many replacement pilots lacked the combat experience of earlier war aviators. The cumulative losses from the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, and the defense of Marianas had hollowed out the veteran core of Japan's air arm. Now, interceptors attempting to defend Tokyo often climbed into combat against better-trained, well-fueled escort pilots flying aircraft optimized for high-altitude performance. The Mustang's Merlin engine maintained power in thin air. Its speed advantage allowed American pilots to dictate engagement geometry. Japanese fighters such as the Ki-84 Hate could match performance under ideal conditions, but mechanical reliability and fuel quality were inconsistent in the final months of the war. Combat reports from both sides described short, violent engagements. Japanese aircraft attempting to approach bomber formations were intercepted and forced into defensive spirals. Some pilots attempted ramming tactics in desperation. Others disengaged to preserve aircraft and fuel. The attritional math became unforgiving. For every successful interception, Japanese units risked disproportionate losses. The presence of escorts reduced opportunities for concentrated bomber attacks. B-29 formations increasingly reached targets with fewer coordinated assaults against them. Within headquarters in Tokyo, staff officers reviewing loss reports confronted a reality that had been building for months. Air superiority over the home islands was slipping away. This was not a single catastrophic defeat. It was a gradual erosion of capacity. Each escorted mission compounded strain on maintenance crews, pilot rosters, and fuel reserves. Each strafed airfield represented not only destroyed equipment, but further reduction in sortie potential. Strategically, the implications extended beyond immediate losses. With escort fighters present, American bombers could operate with increased confidence and frequency. Industrial facilities critical to aircraft production, engine manufacturing, and logistics networks faced sustained pressure. Japan's ability to rebuild its air force was attacked simultaneously in the factory and in the sky. By May 1945, escorted B-29 raids had become routine rather than exceptional. For Japanese officers who had once relied on distance as strategic insulation, the shift was profound. The ocean barrier that had long protected the home islands from sustained fighter presence was gone. The capture of Iwo Jima had removed the final geographic obstacle. The Mustang had translated that geographic gain into operational dominance. The skies above Tokyo, once defended with expectation of at least partial control, were now contested spaces where American fighters frequently held initiative. In that quiet realization lay the true turning point. The defense of the capital had entered its final phase, shaped not by hope of regaining superiority, but by attempts to endure under its absence. By mid-1945, the escorted bombing campaign had transformed from an experimental operation into a relentless strategic offensive. B-29 formations, shielded by the North American P-51 Mustang from Iwo Jima, struck with increasing regularity. The combination of long-range precision and continuous fighter protection forced Japanese air defense into an untenable position. Industrial districts in Tokyo, Yokohama, and surrounding regions faced unceasing raids. Aircraft engine factories, metalworks, and munitions plants were targeted repeatedly. Japanese reports estimated that thousands of tons production capacity were destroyed or heavily damaged. With each mission, the ability to replenish aircraft losses diminished further. The human cost, though measured in numbers, was also psychological. Factory workers endured air raids night after night, and urban areas saw mass evacuations. Many civilians fled to rural areas or temporary shelters, while military planners struggled to maintain operational control over airspace now continuously contested by American escorts. American reports highlighted the efficiency of escort operations. Bombers reached targets with reduced losses compared to unescorted missions of 1944. Fighter pilots flew multiple sorties, both escorting and engaging remaining Japanese interceptors. Casualty figures among escort pilots were lower than expected, though the missions remained hazardous. Fuel calculations, navigation, and enemy engagement had to be precise, yet the outcome demonstrated the strategic leverage of combining air superiority with long-range bombing. Japanese air defense had to disperse remaining aircraft across wider areas, attempting to cover multiple approaches. But the presence of Mustangs meant that interceptors frequently engaged in fragmented combat. The coordination necessary for concentrated attacks was disrupted before it could fully develop, leaving B-29 crews to complete their bombing runs with increasing effectiveness. This operational pressure accelerated the attrition of Japan's air power. Veteran pilots were lost or overextended. Aircraft grounded due to maintenance limitations or fuel shortages were destroyed in strafing raids by escort fighters. Airfields themselves became precarious hubs rather than secure bases of operation. Economically, the sustained bombing campaign disrupted transportation, raw material distribution, and industrial workflow. Factories that survived raids often faced delays in restarting production, and the logistical strain compounded the effect of prior losses in naval and ground campaigns. Cumulatively, these results signaled a decisive shift. Tokyo and surrounding industrial regions could no longer rely on distance or defensive preparation. The combination of B-29 bombers and P-51 escorts had rendered the capital vulnerable, both physically and psychologically, and set the stage for the final months of the Pacific conflict. The implications of sustained escorted bombing went far beyond immediate destruction. Japanese command and civilian leadership faced a stark reality. The home islands were no longer insulated by geography, and their air defense system had reached a point of near collapse. Reports from April and May 1945 detailed the challenges Japanese officers confronted. Interceptor sorties became increasingly perilous. Pilots experienced exhaustion from repeated high-altitude engagements against faster, well-armed Mustangs. Fuel shortages restricted training for new pilots, further reducing combat effectiveness. Aircraft production, already strained from prior bombings and material shortages, could not keep pace with losses. In effect, Japan's ability to contest the skies over Tokyo was diminishing daily. Strategically, the sustained presence of escort fighters altered both Allied and Japanese operational planning. For the United States, it allowed increased bombing frequency, better accuracy, and reduced bomber attrition. Each successful mission further degraded Japan's industrial output and eroded morale. B-29 formations, confident in the protective screen of Mustangs, could undertake more ambitious raids on aircraft factories, oil depots, and transportation hubs, systematically dismantling Japan's war-making capacity. Japanese civilian morale, already frayed by prior incendiary attacks, suffered further. Cities were no longer only targets of night raids. The escorting fighters added a visible, intimidating presence during daylight hours. Survivors recalled seeing agile American aircraft maneuver above industrial zones, strafing airfields or intercepting local defenders, symbolizing that nowhere was safe. Not the factories, not the airfields, and not the skies themselves. For military planners, the psychological toll was severe. Officers had relied on the assumption that bomber formations, unescorted over great distances, could be challenged effectively. With the Mustang escort, that assumption no longer held. Defensive strategies built around limited engagement windows, calculated climb times, and coordinated interceptor formations were rendered ineffective. Japanese pilots increasingly found themselves reacting to American initiative rather than executing planned defenses. By June 1945, the combination of strategic bombing and escorted operations had created a near-total erosion of air control over Tokyo and the Kanto Plain. Japanese leaders recognized that even experienced pilots and remaining aircraft could not alter the outcome. The presence of Mustangs had not merely complicated defense, it had fundamentally shifted the operational balance. Air superiority, once a contested and fluctuating status, had tilted irrevocably toward the Americans. This collapse of defensive certainty influenced broader strategic decisions. Japan's remaining air resources were diverted to attempt defense of other industrial and urban centers, diluting effectiveness. Civilian evacuation orders increased. Transportation of resources slowed, and the psychological perception of invulnerability vanished. The capital itself, the symbolic and industrial heart of Japan, had become a contested zone in which Japanese forces could no longer assert control. In effect, the Mustang escort mission over Tokyo exemplified a turning point in modern warfare. Technological innovation, combined with geographic advantage, produced a force multiplier that disrupted both enemy operations and morale. Japan's air defense, once structured around predictable assumptions and a geographic buffer, had collapsed under the weight of sustained, well-executed aerial strategy. The skies over Tokyo, once thought protected by distance and doctrine, had become a domain dominated by American initiative. The psychological shock among Japanese officers, already hinted at in radar reports and engagement outcomes, now manifested in strategic recalculations. The realization that their capital could not be defended from the air and that American air power could operate with near impunity. The escorted bombing of Tokyo in 1945 stands as a testament to the intersection of technology, strategy, and geography in modern warfare. The capture of Iwo Jima and the deployment of North American P-51 Mustang transformed what had once been a predictable air defense environment into a fully contested battlefield over Japan's capital. A physical barrier, hundreds of miles of ocean, had been erased, and with it, Japan's long-held assumptions of aerial security. The Mustang's role extended beyond mere protection. Its presence reshaped Japanese tactical calculations, disrupted planned interceptions, and forced reactive engagement at multiple levels. Japanese pilots and officers confronted a new reality. American air power was no longer distant, predictable, or vulnerable. It had become dominant, precise, and relentless. Each engagement, each strafing pass, each successful escort mission chipped away at both material capacity and psychological resilience. For the men in the B-29 formations, the escorts provided not only a shield but a new confidence, the ability to strike with greater precision, knowing the skies were guarded. For Japanese command, the shock was profound. Decades of air defense doctrine had been invalidated almost overnight, revealing the limits of distance, preparation, and technology when pitted against a coordinated, adaptive opponent. In historical perspective, the escorted raid highlighted a broader truth about World War II. Control of the skies could dictate the fate of cities, industries, and entire nations. Air superiority was no longer incidental. It was decisive. The P-51 Mustang, once a European fighter, found in the Pacific a role that underscored the evolving nature of air warfare. The ability to extend reach, project power, and shape enemy perception before bombs even fell. The shock experienced by Japanese officers that spring morning was not mere surprise. It was a recognition of the inevitable. The combination of geographic advantage, industrial capacity, and technological innovation had created a force that Japan could neither contest fully nor ignore. It marked a turning point not just for the Pacific Air Campaign, but for the conceptual understanding of modern strategic air power, the moment when dominance in the sky became inseparable from success on the ground, and when distance ceased to protect any nation from determined, well-equipped aerial assault. The lessons resonate far beyond 1945. Innovation, foresight, and the integration of technology with strategy can redefine the rules of warfare, leaving even the most prepared adversaries stunned and unprepared.